Hello and welcome to another edition of the Cross Culture Daily Breakdowns. This week we're looking at just one game, Syracuse versus Johns Hopkins, Saturday night down in Charlotte, North Carolina. 14-13 final score for Cuse. I thought they called it pretty well on the broadcast. Cuse needed a top 10 win. Not that I think anyone doubts that they'll be in the tournament at the end of the year, but having a top 10 non-conference win, at a neutral site, obviously not necessarily a road game, but not at your home building, was important. Good win for Cuse, and tough one for Hopkins after a big win over UVA. And obviously, knowing what we know about the number one seed, maybe Hopkins had a chance to be number one yesterday. Had this game kind of broken out differently. The big story of the game was obviously the faceoffs and the failed clears by Hopkins. Faceoffs 22-9 in favor of Cuse. Honestly, it felt more lopsided than that. Hopkins was able to create some chances off faceoffs. It seems like the only ones they won were pinch and pop out the front, creating offense. So kudos to them for that. But 22-9 just isn't going to get it done most days. And then especially when you combine that with the failed clears, 11 for 17 clearing for Hopkins. That's just not going to get it done. And most of those weren't necessarily great rides. It's just kind of sloppy play from the back, sloppy stick work. This was a really sloppy game in general. I think I've been talking about throughout the month of February and March how polished the play has been so far, especially for early season. This one looked sloppy. I think the weather had a factor. I think the field surface had a factor. And also, the semester's starting to wear on. Guys are getting tired. Guys are getting sore. Syracuse is on spring break, but you figure we're in midterm season, stuff like that. There are other things that come into these games, and this one was sloppier than we've seen. Really astounding statistic from this game. Syracuse went 10 for 12 on clears. To only have 12 clears is incredible. It speaks to the face-off differential and the failed clears by Hopkins in terms of Syracuse would just get those possessions back without having to clear it. But to have less clear opportunities than goals against. Hopkins scored 13 goals and Cuse only cleared it 12 times. It's unusual. When Hopkins got the ball, they were very efficient with it. They shot it pretty well. And just kind of a weird game. And the faceoffs really swung this one for Cuse. You don't have to win the faceoff battle, but you can't get smoked. So that's pretty much the name of the game these days. It's got to be roughly even. And especially a couple times in the game, Cuse went on runs of 2, 3, 4 goals. That's when the faceoffs really become an issue. Hopkins didn't play offense in this game for the first 5 minutes, and there's other stretches of the game where they did the same thing. Tough to win games when the differential's going like that. And then the last point, kind of big point I want to make about the game is, we're at this interesting point in college lacrosse where there's all of these grad transfers at all these good schools, and the depth is more than it's ever been. And it just feels like there's these guys who are going to come into a game and just have a game. It might not be every game. It's a lot like basketball. Your bench guy might not come in and score 30 every night, but there's a number of guys who could come in and score the equivalent of 30 every night. And Jake Stevens, I think in this game, he hasn't maybe been the biggest focal point of the Cuse offense early on this season. This is the most I've seen him play in a game. He was great. He was really the difference maker in the game. A lot of talk about how he can do everything. He can play face-off wings, he can play defense. He's great in the middle of the field. He really showed in this game. He showed he can take the face-off wings, but he's just a great offensive midfielder as well. He was aggressive, getting to the middle of the field, and when you have to short stick one of him or English, it's tough. Those guys are two of the fastest players in Division I. A lot of the middies we're seeing have success are either the big dodging types, the big strong guys like Matt Collison from Hopkins, or the really small, quick guys. Stevens and English can really just burn. And on top of that, they're 24, 25 years old. They're college graduates. They played in a lot of big games outdoors and in the box. They played in the Final Four. These guys aren't afraid, and I thought they were big for Cuse. At times they were sloppy, and in the end they're some of their best and definitely some of their oldest, most experienced players made some plays for them. And Mule is a good example of that as well. And I think every team in college lacrosse just has these guys who can come in and do it for you. Like Peshko had 4 last week, maybe a little quieter this week for Hopkins. There's so many bodies out there who you might not think about on a day-to-day basis, but on the right night, they can really do it for you. And the team that wins this thing at the end is going to have those guys show up in Final Four weekend and in the playoffs, in general. So the story of the game, other than that, from a tactical perspective, was, Hopkins really supported the ball well and aggressively, and I think probably more aggressively than Cuse was expecting and than Cuse has seen. Syracuse, very unselfish team, very slick team. At times, most of the time, they have 6 guys who can really handle it, who can really feed it. A lot of small area passes. It's very Canadian feel in that sense sometimes. Go figure. Your coach is Gary Gait, the greatest Canadian lacrosse player of all time. You have 3 Canadians in their top 6. Joe Spallina, who came up and played box last year, and then, Yule and Leo are very skilled in their own right. The natural thought process with that is, okay, no slide. Let's make these guys, earn their shots. They're a great passing team, so let's limit passes. And Hopkins didn't do that. What they did was they limited all passes into the heart of the defense. They really packed it in tight in this game. And I think they may have exposed a little bit of a weakness for Cuse, which is in their top 6. You might not have a guy who scares you beyond like 13, 14 yards. And I know that's a long shot, but as I'm going to talk about, Degnan on Hopkins is a good example. When Cuse tried to pack the paint against Hopkins when Cuse is on defense, they just throw it to Degnan and he just scored from the top of the defense. I think this game plan from Hopkins showed a little bit that if you can really pack it against Cuse, maybe there's not someone who can really hose it from out top. Hiltz is a fantastic shooter. Spallina is a very good shooter. Finn and Sammy English are very good shooters, but maybe not from 14 yards, right? It's just a range thing and just kind of something interesting to monitor. So on that note, the most frequent offense we saw in this game from Cuse was the invert. And Hopkins did something a little bit unusual that nowadays. It was very, very popular a few years ago. You see relatively fewer teams do it now, and that is they played an invert package. So when Cuse went to a single invert, Hopkins basically ditched their man-to-man defense and got into a set formation to play against the invert. How these generally work, there's a designated slider who always stands basically on the top of the crease, and he's going no matter what. No matter what direction the dodge goes, he's going. And then typically you have 4 defenders left. Typically there's one man inside of the defense who most of the time they'll actually play with their back to the goal because their only job is to collect cutters that come in. Most offenses, pretty much any way to play invert offense, you want someone cutting into the defense. So there'll be someone in there to collect cutters, and then the top 3 guys will play basically a triangle. What are the advantages of this? The big one is you don't give up dunks typically in the middle of the defense because you're packing it in as tight as you can and because you have a defender waiting there just taking cutters. It's his only job is to take cutters. He's got his back to the ball. He's just looking for guys coming in. It also gives you organization. It gives you something that you can get to, and when offenses are hectic, defense, you can feel like you're dictating because you're in your spots, you know where you're supposed to be, and you can really fly around. And the last advantage is you're not going to let the dodger score. Basically, the slides are going to go quick, no unassisted goals. You're going to make them move it. That's why it was really popular a few years ago when the game was, again, relatively speaking, maybe a little bit less skilled. The more passes you could make, the better for the defense. Teams have gotten away from it now because with all the skip passes and the step-down shooters, it's tough. So that's why you see a little bit less of it now. The other hard part about it is it's hard to get into if you go in the flow. And that's one thing Cuse will probably want to do differently next time is they let Hopkins get set up in the defense, and that's when they had trouble. Late in the game, I thought it was smart by Syracuse. They really started leaning on the shot clock and just killing time, especially on resets, similar to how you'd see in box lacrosse. And I think that's probably a game management thing they saw, seeing how the Hopkins offense was doing and knowing that they were going to get the faceoffs back. So they really did a good job of draining the clock in the fourth quarter. But in the meantime, I think they let Hopkins get set up into this zone defense. What are the disadvantages? Well, one is it creates odd man scenarios regardless of how the dodger does. So typically the slide man is going to go regardless in these scenarios. So if you have good short sticks, you're not getting beat. You're kind of sliding for no reason, at least hypothetically. If the offense is ready for it, you can have guys covering nobody, kind of like it's just a zone defense. So if the offense all of a sudden clears everyone out of the middle of the field, the guy collecting the slides is covering nobody. And also, if you're really well prepared for it offensively, you can kind of scheme up plays because it's a predictable look from the defense, more predictable than you would see in most scenarios. And then the disadvantage is the backside is typically open. So the Dodger will pick a side, usually will move it quickly because the slide's coming, and then there's a rotation that happens on the backside of the defense, and pretty much any way you slice it, there's going to be an advantage somewhere at the top or the backside of the defense. Again, it's meant to protect the paint, limit unassisted goals, and limit one pass goals to the crease that are really dunks. So Hopkins was very successful with this, and I thought it was interesting that Cuse went to the invert a lot, even when it wasn't necessarily working. And I think that shows that they realize it's going to be tough, always dodging from the midfield. Now, down the stretch of the game, Stevens and English started to really get after the Hopkins guys. That's where the resets and just playing a lot of possessions helped with those guys. But I did think it was interesting that Cuse kept going back to the invert when Hopkins was having success with their package. Basically, the Cuse's problem was they were too small. They were too small offensively. The backside man was very typically open, but sometimes that guy was too tight to see the skip passes, and Hopkins gets their sticks in the lanes better than most teams you'll see around the country. They, when I watched the UVA game, I said on this channel that maybe they're getting a little bit lucky with some of those tip passes, and they're relying on them more than they should. Well, they did the same thing in this game. There's lots of plays that looked open, and the Hopkins guys were there in the lanes. It's not a fluke. That's what they're good at. So they make you throw skip passes, and they were very good at keeping the ball on one side of the field. So Dodger would kick it. The open guy is on the back side of the defense, and Hopkins was good at getting in shooting lanes and at discouraging the ball from making it to the backside, which plays right into the advantage of that invert package. Some of the Cuse goals that they scored, which I'll show on film, they looked very easy because they just opened it right up. And it's very hard to support to guys all over the field. And when Cuse got bigger, that's when the skip lanes opened up, and especially Hiltz had a lot of success just whipping passes through. He's a great player. The time and space kind of help with that. The other thing about Hopkins is Chaser Irwin's outstanding. He was great again in this game. He is unbelievable in the low angle. He cuts the field better than most goalies you'll see, similar to actually kind of how Liam Enterman does against Notre Dame, and how some of the bigger goalies in the PLL do it, like Blaze Reardon. It's just not going to go low angle. So sometimes, Hopkins, Cuse rather, was trying to step in to some low angle shots out of the invert. Those aren't going to go on Chase with any sort of regularity, especially in a wet environment where your sticks are not maybe as dialed as they would be in other places. And then lastly, again, like I said, Cuse has all this skill that they want to try to get close to the net to get dunks. That's why their offense is so good, because it really can hum, and they can really make you pay for not being dialed in off the ball. They have several good passers, more probably great passers than most teams do, and they can really pick you apart. I think the one thing they missed in this game was a guy like Degnan who could just stand at the top of the defense and just sling it. That's one of the other ways to combat that zone package, is to just put somebody up at their straightening line, throw in the ball, let them crow hop once, and sling it. There's not a lot of guys around the country who can do that, but there are some, and Hopkins has a few of them. I'm not saying Cuse doesn't have those guys, because they have so many talented offensive players who are good at a lot of things, but something to watch. I think, was Cuse ready for the package? Maybe not. Maybe something they saw on the scout or not. They'll have a better plan for it going forward. This is an interesting kind of time of year where you're starting to see teams, A, figure out their identity, and B, start to try, secondary, tertiary options. You saw Cuse go to a zone late in this game. In the Maryland-Brown game, Brown played a zone for a long part of the game. You don't see much zone in February for two reasons. One, teams are trying to establish their base defense, and two, they haven't had enough time to practice the zone. No one is starting with zone defense in lacrosse the way they would maybe in basketball. You start with man, then you add zone. This is starting to be the time of year when you start to see some of those things come in. You saw Cuse play zone. You see Hopkins get to the invert package. That might not have even been something that they were really getting into a whole lot until recently. Overall, I think Hopkins is going to be pretty happy with their play defensively. They played a lot of defense in this game. And again, Chase was great. The field clears are what they are. A lot of them did seem like weather-related, sloppy stick handling, which there's only so much you can do about that. And I thought it was a good scheme from the Hopkins staff to limit what the Cuse guys do very well. They slid very early to guys like Leo, who can really hurt you off the dodge. And Hopkins was very good on man down. That's something Cuse is going to have to figure out as we go later in the spring as well. And lastly, on the broadcast, they said Hopkins might have the best rope unit. That's at least the second broadcast that I've heard that on, and I'm not making fun of the broadcast at all. I thought it was a good call. But like I said last week, there are lots of teams who are in this mix for the best rope unit, and it's not going to be as clear of a designation as other teams, especially when, unlike midfield attack and some other positions, it's very hard to quantify who's actually the best, especially when you take into account schemes and other, certain schools ask their short sticks to do more or comparatively less. Switching sides of the field to the Hopkins offense, very efficient day for them. I thought Will Mark was very good in the goal for Cuse, and it didn't really matter for Hopkins when they got their chances. They were pretty solid with it. Degnan, obviously the highlight. The difference between the good and the great shooters is the quick release. I think if you watch old Ryan Brown clips from Hopkins, he just gets it off in any manner of ways, and it's super quick, and Degnan's got a little bit of that. He's got a nice stroke. He was aggressive shooting the ball in this game. Could have had a couple more. He looked like he himself was victim of a wet stick a little bit, ball sliding maybe a little bit more than he wanted to. But, man, he's just such a weapon for this Hopkins team who likes to initiate a significant amount of their offense from below the goal. And it's either a pass to Degnan or a step down or draw a slide, pass, and you just really have to find the kid because he can hurt you from a long way out and he doesn't need any time. On that note, I thought Bauer, number 7, was very good in this game. He's a lot like Angelus, and he basically gives them two options for the big little. So, a lot of teams have – the traditional, kind of way of playing offense was you had an ex-attackman who was a dodger, a crease guy, and then maybe an in-between guy. Bauer, who sometimes plays attack, sometimes comes out of the midfield, he really gives two options for Angelus and himself to play behind the goal and play in the big little, and he had a couple big assists. Those guys clearly have eyes for Degnan, and I would too, if he can shoot it like that, and they're just really dangerous, and then they can play with each other. So they can play in the big little with each other. If either of them has a matchup that they like, they can just kind of pop out, go the other guy the ball, and go to work. So I thought that was good for Hopkins. And then, Collison does a lot of the same things as well as Degnan with the spacing. He had a couple legit shots. And one thing Hopkins does well is they get, they have a good feel for their personnel, where they get Angelus and Bauer, they're smaller, quicker guys. They get them kind of buzzing around behind the goal. And they seem to get Grimes, Degnan, and Collison, their big lefties, isolated in the low angle. So what I mean by that is in the low wing, they typically dodge between 0 and 5 yards above the goal, just outside the hash marks. Very hard place to slide from because you can see where it's coming and you don't want to give up passes to the back pipe. But effective. Hopkins got a bunch of goals off that and should have had another one off of a very nice dodge by Collison. And then Mark just made a 6 save on it. So, not much you can do about that. So, again, Hopkins plays good offense. They switch sides of the field. They switch above and behind the goal. They have some legit spacing, which I think really helps. They just didn't have the ball enough in this game, and there's only so many ways to overcome possession battles. And when you're already down at the faceoffs and then you add the field clears, the math really hurts you. Syracuse, should absolutely not apologize for that. They played their butts off. They finally got a big win over a top-ranked team, and it's going to really help them going forward. This is probably a matchup we might see again late in the spring. These teams are deep. They're loaded. They got a lot of talent, and I'm sure we'll see more of them come springtime. So that's all I got for this one. A sloppy game, but a fun one. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.